Picture a winter night in the American heartland. It's December 1811, and a small river town called New Madrid sits quietly along the Mississippi, a frontier outpost most of the young country has never heard of. Then, in the pitch dark, the ground simply comes apart. Church bells 1,000 miles away in Boston start ringing on their own. Sections of the Mississippi River appear to run backward. New lakes tear open where solid ground used to be. This isn't a scene from a disaster film. It's documented American history, and it happened nowhere near California. It happened in Missouri. Ask most Americans today to name the country's most dangerous earthquake fault, and almost none of them will say the central Mississippi Valley. And yet, according to decades of seismological research, that's exactly where the single most catastrophic earthquake hazard facing the eastern two-thirds of the United States actually sits, hidden beneath a region that has spent 2 centuries assuming earthquakes are somebody else's problem. The New Madrid Seismic Zone stretches roughly 150 miles through the central Mississippi Valley, crossing 5 states, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, and cutting across the Mississippi River itself in 3 places and the Ohio River in 2 more. Its rough path traces Interstate 55 in a zigzag from Marked Tree, Arkansas, north through Blytheville, into the Missouri Booth Heel near New Madrid and Crothersville, and on toward Charleston, Missouri and Cairo, Illinois. What makes this fault so scientifically strange isn't its length or its maximum potential size, it's where it sits relative to the rest of the planet's tectonic machinery. California sits directly on the boundary between 2 enormous plates, the Pacific and North American, grinding against each other in a process seismologists understand well and monitor continuously. New Madrid sits more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest active plate boundary, buried deep in the interior of a single, supposedly stable continental plate. Geologists call this an intraplate seismic zone, and it remains one of the genuinely hardest categories of earthquake hazard on Earth to study, forecast, or fully explain, because the forces driving it aren't the simple direct friction responsible for the earthquakes most Americans picture when they think about seismic risk. The story of why this fault exists at all begins roughly 750 million years in the past, with an event geologists call the Reelfoot Rift. During that ancient period, the landmass that would eventually become North America began tearing apart. The early stages of the same fundamental process that elsewhere on the planet eventually opens a brand new ocean between 2 separated continents. Here, the process stalled. The crust beneath what's now the central Mississippi Valley stretched, thinned, and cracked extensively before losing momentum, healing back together and leaving behind a long, buried scar of permanently weakened rock. That scar never regained the strength of the undisturbed crust surrounding it. According to research from the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, far-field tectonic stresses, generated by the slow push of the mid-Atlantic ridge on one side of the continent and the pull of subducting plates along the Pacific margin on the other, travel across the entire breadth of the North American plate and concentrate specifically within this ancient, weakened zone. The deeply buried Reelfoot Rift faults act almost like a channel, funneling regional strain into this exact stretch of ground, despite sitting thousands of kilometers from any active plate boundary where that strain actually originates. It's a mechanism found in similar failed rift zones elsewhere across the interior of continents worldwide. A recently identified buried rift beneath the Texas Panhandle shares the same basic recipe. But New Madrid remains the best documented, most seismically active example on the North American continent. Between December 1811 and February 1812, this buried fault system produced a sequence of earthquakes that remain, to this day, among the largest ever recorded in the continental United States. The main shocks are estimated at magnitude 8.0 or greater. On the USGS's ranking of the 20 largest earthquakes ever recorded across all 50 states, the 3 main New Madrid shocks land at 18th, 19th, and 20th, with Alaska's more frequent plate boundary earthquakes dominating the higher ranks. Narrow that same list to only the 48 contiguous states, though, and the New Madrid sequence climbs to 5th, 6th, and 7th place, meaning that among earthquakes to strike the heart of the continental U.S., this remains one of the most powerful ever documented. The felt area was staggering. The sequence was felt across roughly 5 million square kilometers, 10 to 15 times larger than the felt area a comparable magnitude earthquake produces on California's San Andreas Fault. Church bells rang in Boston, more than 1,000 miles away. Chimneys cracked in Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis. Contemporary accounts describe stretches of the Mississippi River appearing to briefly reverse course as the shaking and ground deformation created temporary waterfalls and rapids where none had existed. Sections of the ground opened into fissures that swallowed livestock, spewing sand and water in what geologists now recognize as liquefaction. An entire new lake, Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, formed when the ground abruptly sank and filled with Mississippi River water. Survivors described weeks of continued aftershocks, so persistent and unsettling that many families reportedly slept outdoors rather than risk being caught inside when the next one struck. Because the region was so sparsely populated at the time, the human death toll remained comparatively low relative to the sheer scale of the shaking. That's the detail that matters most for understanding today's risk. In 1811, an earthquake this powerful struck a landscape with almost no people and almost no substantial buildings in its path. Today, that same fault runs directly beneath Memphis, St. Louis, Little Rock, and Evansville, along with countless smaller towns, almost entirely unprepared for anything resembling what this zone has already proven itself capable of producing. Here's the detail that makes New Madrid's hazard genuinely counterintuitive. The physical composition of the ground itself works against the region rather than for it. California's earthquakes propagate through fractured, geologically complex western crust, terrain that tends to absorb and scatter seismic energy relatively quickly as it radiates outward. The central and eastern United States sits instead on much older, harder, more continuous bedrock. According to USGS research, seismic waves traveling through that harder, more uniform crust travel farther and lose energy far more slowly than equivalent waves moving through California's fractured geology. Layer onto that a second compounding factor. The central Mississippi Valley is blanketed in thick, soft, unconsolidated sediment, sand, silt, and clay deposited over thousands of years by the river and its tributaries, sometimes extending hundreds of feet before reaching solid bedrock. That loose sediment dramatically amplifies seismic shaking compared to what the same earthquake would produce on hard rock. Combine efficient, long-distance wave travel through hard regional bedrock with severe local amplification wherever that energy passes through the valley's soft sediment, and a magnitude 7.0 New Madrid earthquake is expected to produce damaging shaking across an area many times larger than an equivalent magnitude quake would cover almost anywhere in California. If the physics alone sound concerning, the built environment sitting on top of this fault system makes the real-world consequences considerably worse. California has spent decades building some of the most rigorous seismic codes, public education campaigns, and emergency infrastructure in the world, precisely because generations of Californians have lived with major earthquakes as an accepted fact of life. The central Mississippi Valley has none of that same institutional muscle memory. Despite sitting atop a fault the USGS has flagged as carrying the greatest earthquake risk anywhere east of the Rockies. Memphis illustrates the gap starkly. The city is estimated to contain more than 25,000 unreinforced masonry buildings still in active use. Brick or stone structures built without the steel reinforcement modern seismic codes require, exactly the construction type most prone to catastrophic collapse during strong shaking. The city has established a voluntary retrofit program, but compliance has remained extremely low. Historic downtown buildings, churches with tall, unsupported steeples, and pre-1970s schools built from unreinforced masonry all sit scattered across the region's urban centers, largely unmodified. Buildings that, in California, would in many cases already have been retrofitted or replaced under decades of enforced seismic code requirements. The region's critical infrastructure carries its own exposure. Interstate 40 and Interstate 55 both cross directly through the highest hazard portions of the New Madrid Zone, alongside numerous Mississippi River bridges engineered decades before modern seismic design standards existed for this specific region. Memphis alone sits at the center of an enormous national logistics network, home to one of the busiest cargo airports in the world and serving as the primary hub for a major global package delivery company. A rupture severe enough to damage several of these crossings and this infrastructure simultaneously wouldn't just create a regional disaster. It carries realistic potential to sever transportation and freight corridors a significant share of the country's east-west commercial traffic currently depends on. Here's the part of the New Madrid story that rarely makes it into public conversation. Credentialed seismologists don't fully agree on how dangerous this fault remains today, and the disagreement is real, ongoing, and genuinely interesting. One camp, associated most prominently with Seth Stein at Northwestern University, points to modern GPS measurements, showing the ground around New Madrid deforming too slowly to sustain the kind of recurring major earthquakes the 1811-1812 sequence would suggest as a regular pattern. Stein's research on regional heat flow found temperatures in the New Madrid zone run no higher than the surrounding central U.S., undercutting one theoretical explanation for why this particular buried rift might remain unusually weak and earthquake-prone compared to similar ancient rift zones elsewhere on the continent that show no comparable modern activity. Stein and colleagues have suggested the 1811-1812 sequence might represent the tail end of an active seismic cycle rather than its middle, with the underlying earthquake-producing process potentially migrating toward a different ancient weak zone elsewhere in the central U.S. over time. The opposing, more mainstream camp including the USGS, the University of Memphis's Center for Earthquake Research and Information, and most seismologists actively studying the region, argues that the historical and paleoseismic record clearly shows a pattern of repeated large earthquakes striking this specific zone, and that pattern should be treated as an ongoing hazard regardless of what a comparatively short modern GPS observation window happens to show. Paleoseismic evidence, sand blows and liquefaction features preserved in the ground and dated using radiocarbon methods, has identified comparably large earthquake sequences, striking the same zone around the year 900 CE and again around 1450 CE, with some research suggesting large quake activity stretching back at least 5,000 years. That deeper pattern is exactly why the USGS position, the one that actually drives national hazard maps and the building codes based on them, continues treating New Madrid as carrying serious, ongoing risk rather than adopting the more optimistic, dying fault interpretation as the operating assumption for public safety. Translating that scientific debate into concrete figures, the USGS currently estimates a 25 to 40% probability of a magnitude 6.0 or greater earthquake striking the New Madrid Seismic Zone within the next 50 years. Alongside a smaller but still meaningful 7 to 10% probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater event in that same window. These aren't predictions of a specific date. Precise earthquake prediction remains just as far beyond modern seismology for New Madrid as it is for any fault anywhere. They're probabilistic hazard estimates built from the combination of historical record, paleoseismic evidence, and physical fault modeling used to generate hazard maps across the entire country. The zone stays active on a day-to-day basis without any major event, averaging roughly 200 measured earthquakes per year, the overwhelming majority too small for anyone to feel without specialized equipment. Two more recent, genuinely damaging events reinforce that this isn't a dormant historical curiosity. A magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck near Marked Tree, Arkansas, on January 4th, 1843, and a magnitude 6.6 earthquake centered near Charleston, Missouri, struck on October 31st, 1895. The USGS and CIRI maintain a dense seismometer network across the zone, tracking that steady background activity both as an ongoing data set and as an early warning system for any unusual shift in behavior. It's worth directly addressing why researchers and disaster planners genuinely describe New Madrid's potential consequences as rivaling or exceeding California's worst-case scenarios, even though California carries a considerably higher day-to-day probability of experiencing a major earthquake in any given year. This isn't about which fault is more likely to rupture soon. On that specific question, California's more frequently active systems remain the higher probability near-term risk by most measures. It's about consequence, given an actual major rupture. And on that specific dimension, New Madrid's combination of factors is genuinely difficult to match anywhere else in the country. A magnitude 7.6 earthquake in the New Madrid zone is expected to cause major damage concentrated near the fault system itself, across the Missouri Boot Heel, northeastern Arkansas, and western Kentucky and Tennessee, with significant damage extending considerably farther, reaching north along the Mississippi Valley toward St. Louis and along the Ohio and Wabash River valleys as well. That's a geographic footprint of serious damage far larger than an equivalent magnitude earthquake would produce almost anywhere in California, purely from the combination of efficient regional wave propagation through hard bedrock and severe local amplification through the valley's soft river sediment. Add the region's comparatively minimal seismic building codes, the tens of thousands of unreinforced masonry structures still standing across Memphis, the limited earthquake-specific emergency infrastructure compared to California's decades of investment, and a public that has largely never been taught to think of this part of the country as earthquake country at all, and the resulting disaster scenario, however less probable in any given year than a major California quake, carries realistic potential to affect a dramatically larger population and geographic footprint, with dramatically less institutional readiness to absorb the impact. This isn't purely a story of neglect. FEMA and regional emergency management agencies across the affected states have developed detailed disaster scenario planning specifically built around a major New Madrid rupture, wargaming the multi-state coordination challenge a magnitude 7+ earthquake here would create, including the likely severing of major highway and river crossings, and the reality that this region, unlike California, would likely face longer periods of relative isolation before substantial outside help could physically arrive. Memphis's retrofit program, however limited its compliance rate, represents a genuine municipal-level acknowledgement that the city's building stock carries real, quantifiable seismic risk requiring active mitigation. And the ongoing scientific debate between Stein's camp and the broader USGS SERI consensus, however unresolved, continues generating genuinely valuable research. Each new GPS strain measurement, each new paleoseismic excavation, each refined date on the 900 CE and 1450 CE events sharpens the overall picture of how this fault actually behaves. For residents across the central Mississippi Valley, none of this is a case for panicking over an imminent, precisely datable catastrophe. No legitimate seismologist studying this fault on either side of the ongoing debate claims that kind of specific predictive certainty. It's a case for taking a genuinely underappreciated regional hazard seriously enough to invest in the same unglamorous, incremental measures that have made California's far more famous fault systems considerably less deadly relative to their activity level than they'd otherwise be. Updated building codes, structural retrofits for the most vulnerable existing buildings, public earthquake education, and household-level emergency planning for a region that has, for generations, simply never had to think of itself as earthquake country. That's the genuinely strange part of this entire story. California's earthquake risk is culturally legible, woven into building codes, school drills, disaster movies, everyday public consciousness. New Madrid carries a documented, scientifically serious hazard profile that, on several specific dimensions, felt area, ground amplification, infrastructure vulnerability, public unpreparedness, arguably exceeds what a comparable magnitude California earthquake would produce, and it remains almost entirely absent from that same everyday awareness. Closing that gap, more than any single engineering fix, may be the single most important step available for reducing the eventual human cost whenever this ancient, buried fault finally does move again. The same way it once made a river run backward and rang church bells 1,000 miles from where the ground actually broke. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure you're subscribed, because we'll keep covering the ongoing research and scientific debate surrounding the new Madrid Seismic Zone as new studies continue refining our understanding of this genuinely underappreciated fault system. Let us know in the comments if you live anywhere across the central Mississippi Valley, and whether this changes how you think about the ground beneath your own home. We'll see you in the next one.